Our next speaker is Paula Young Lee. Paula is currently a faculty fellow at Tufts University. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and has published widely on the history of animal representation and captivity. Her most recent books include the forthcoming Gorgeous Beasts, Animal Bodies in Historical Perspective, which is co-edited with Joan Landis and Paul Youngquist, and also forthcoming Aristocrats and Other Animals, Political Death, is it death? And Animal Life at the Revolutionary Menagerie in Paris. Currently, Paula is completing a much-anticipated book on the 17th century menagerie at Versailles. The title of her paper this morning is Of Cabbages and Kings, the Politics of Planting Vegetables at the Jardin des Plantes. Paula.
I'd like to begin first by thanking Sue Ann Prince and our wonderful staff for all the work they've done to prepare this wonderful symposium and exhibition. I'm truly honored to be invited to speak here today. And I'd also like to thank all the members of the audience for taking the time out of their busy Fridays to come here and listen to the talks, which have been so far absolutely wonderful as well. I've been thrilled to hear such intelligent people speak about subjects so dear to my heart. So I am now going to add a slightly different twist on this. We're backtracking in time a little bit to the French Revolution and talking about the Jardin des Plantes. Can you all hear me before I begin? Is it fine? Okay, thanks. Okay. In 1775, the British diarist Hester Thrale visited France on her honeymoon and was invited to, quote, the King's Museum, where the famous Mr. Daubenton waited to attend us and display the natural curiosities deposited in this suite of rooms and arranged lately by Mr. Buffon himself. There she saw precious stones and taxidermied fauna, including the yellow parrot of Cuba, the jabiru, which is a large fishing bird from China, twice the size of the biggest stork I know, and the Promerops of Guinea. Her observations help clarify which curiosities appeared in the 18th century Cabinet du Roi, which is an exercise in which several of the speakers here today are engaged, located on the grounds of a historic Jardin du Roi in Paris. But her comments are perhaps most interesting for her use of the Latin term museum to characterize the Jardin des Plantes or the Jardin du Roi, because it was not commonly used in any context at the time, and it is perhaps the first recorded instance of this word museum being used in reference to the Jardin des Plantes. Nonetheless, 15 years later, in 1790, as the revolutionary furor threatened to destroy institutions of higher learning in general, it was museum that Chief Gardener André Thuin proposed to his colleagues as the proper name for the Jardin du Roi, just as resident naturalist Louis Daubenton subsequently argued before the National Assembly that the Jardin du Roi could be transformed into what he called a true museum by extending its programmatic scope to include all branches of natural history. The only person who objected to this new title, museum, was La Billarderie, the Comte de Buffon's replacement as the new intendant, who insisted that the name should remain Jardin du Roi or Jardin Royal des Plantes, as both affirmed the institution's historical debt to the kings of France, as well as the priority it had placed on plants. La Billarderie complained that Thuin, Daubenton, and the other professors were affecting a sort of total amnesia, an oubli absolu, by changing the name, for it required a willful denial to forget the fact that the Jardin du Roi had been founded by a French king and was continuously supported by the largesse of kings right up to Louis XVI. For La Billarderie, the word museum raised this illustrious past while wrongly focusing attention on what he thought were the accessory collections of natural history. Accused shortly thereafter of abusing the institution's finances and despised by the professors who thought he was an idiot, La Billarderie resigned his post, and 2 years later he lost his head in the revolution. But with the hindsight that comes with the passage of time, it might seem that La Billarderie's accusations were not entirely wrong, because the loaded word museum has indeed transferred all attentions to the collections of natural history, while obscuring a short-lived but politically intense agenda that planned to transform the institution into a place of plants, and specifically into an experimental farm dedicated to agriculture. This paper, then, is a brief overview of the conflicting spheres of expertise that set botany against agriculture, beauty against practicality, and ultimately saw the swift rise and fall of a particular, extremely idealistic vision of museum as a place where culture did not invoke art, but agriculture. On January 9, 1790, Arthur Young went to breakfast at the Tuileries, and he heard Desmarais read a memoir presented to the Société d'Agriculture on the means of improving agriculture in France. The chief points of recommendation were three. First, our prescient, now in retrospect, attention to bees. Two, the importance of what was called panification, or the means by which flowers were transformed into bread. And three, the teaching of the obstetric art, which is presumably in reference to birthing of livestock. Young concluded, on the establishment of a free and patriotic government, to which the national agricultural might look for a new and halcyon days, these were objects doubtless of the very first importance. Indeed, in 1790, the government was strongly promoting an agrarian model of economic exchange that, following the arguments of physiocrats, was essential to consolidate the interests of the bankrupt nation. Between 1793 and 1794, Abbé Henri Grégoire proposed a series of national métairies to be dispersed throughout the country. Dedicated to advancing the rural economy, Grégoire proposed that these agricultural posts would be centrally located, coordinated through the newly created Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, or the former Jardin du Roi, and would rely on regular input from André Thuin, the professor of culture at the museum. The museum would provide these houses of rural economy, or métairies, with the botanical and zoological expertise of its faculty, supplying them with breed types conserved in its armoires and galleries, and actively collect exotic plants and animal specimens that might be usefully naturalized on French soil. In this way, he concluded, the museum could fully realize its mandate of teaching commerce and the arts. The convention's response to Grégoire's ideas were droningly positive. Commerce in France needs only to be the agent of agriculture. It is the solid foundation of French industry, pronounced Camille Tessier. From there, the country's strength, solidity, and happiness will result. Tessier went on to outline a profit-driven program of rustic economy where important parcels of land would be reserved for commercial cultivation. This land would be seeded in Noachian 2x2s with native and foreign plants and animals representing the strongest and most pure of their race, the explicit goal of the breeding project being the perfection and civilization of all that might be useful to the nation. As elaborated by Joseph-Antoine de Boisset, a member of the Comité du Commerce, the program of perfection, domestication, and education might be expanded by placing a Jardin des Plantes within every department in France. The public's understanding of botany would thereby be facilitated, and their resulting fascination with plants would bring them closer to nature. Being simultaneously dedicated to agriculture, these gardens would transform a terrain once regarded as sterile into fertile soil, offering a direct lesson in the powers of cultural regeneration. On a practical level, the results would not only be deliciously edible, but for that same reason would be a great contribution to commerce. These provincial versions of the Parisian Jardin des Plantes, he concluded, this is Boisset, would bring the true principles of agriculture to the peasantry. In order to achieve this worthy goal, the gardens would emphasize things, not words. Institutional stress would be placed on visible results rather than the faulty reasoning of armchair farmers. The key to this program would be the establishment of Métairie, of which the center core would be the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, which was already functioning in this double capacity of serving botany and agriculture. The Jardin des Plantes at the museum, Boisset explained, was already in a condition to furnish the plants necessary to form the foundation of any serious garden. Having established a variety of correspondences with other scientists and institutions, it had long been in the practice of obtaining plants from Asia, Africa, and Central America. Boisset pointed out that some of these species, such as cherry trees, apricot trees, peach trees, fig trees, tuberoses, lilacs, green beans, lentils, melons, and the tastiest peas, had already been naturalized in France with great success. Boisset bluntly dismissed those who raised ideological objections to this soiling practice of naturalization, and hereby raising the specter of miscegenation, xenophobia, and racism projected onto plants. For the plants indigenous to France, he said, were tasteless legumes, insipid fruits, and disagreeable flowers. The central clearinghouse for these useful naturalized plants had been and shall remain, he insisted, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and through its efforts, thus agriculture shall be renewed. Politicians agreed that the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle was indeed the very best place to carry out agricultural experiments, for such undertakings required time and patience, combined with a concentrated group of select specimens, a varied terrain, and cooperative weather. Thus, it was not a task that could be accepted by a peasant farmer whose job was to cultivate crops that would feed the people. The overall plan was for the museum to undertake the naturalization process and establish a foreign plant's viability in France. Instead of useless plants inside the king's gardens, there would be new experimental varieties of artichokes, onions, and cabbages. Once naturalization had been confirmed, the museum would send the specimens out to farms in France and its colonies, where they would be confidently planted as food or forage crops for the benefit of the entire nation. Given that the museum played such a vital role in this land-based plan of moral and economic regeneration, it is unsurprising that during the first few months of its existence, the institution was regularly referred to as the Muséum des Plantes, the Plant Museum, the titular substitution of green and growing things for the text-based study of natural history, signaling where the operative emphases lay for the public and for politicians. Parisians, however, had not misunderstood the new institution's purpose. As outlined by Jean-Baptiste Dubois for gardens in general and the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in particular, all experimental farms destined for the perfection of culture would serve as depots of grains and living animals designed to be propagated in neighboring countries, even while augmenting their overall utility by collecting native and foreign machines and agricultural instruments for the purposes of instruction. As the final component, these experimental farms would naturalize domestic exotic animals into examples of the effects of proper education. And here you're looking at an image which is dated from 1820, but it could very easily be dated around 1790. These domestic animals such as camels, elephants, and merino sheep, which has been a subject of conversation so far, were working livestock animals outside the body of France, and therefore they were one of the first to be brought into, at that point, what was a non-existent menagerie. When architect Jean-Jacques Lequeux presented his Temple to Ceres abundance in the middle of the countryside with its added note, Mamosa, mamelle, mamosa, breasts, and the epigraph, plow and pasture are the two breasts of the state, he was merely giving form to a political vision that was particularly active from 1792, year 2. Its meaning is clear, write garden historians Matteo Vercelloni and Paolo Gallo of Lequeux's peculiar temple to the goddess of the grain. I find that actually quite funny because Lequeux is, if anything but clear in his architectural production. And in this particular case, you can also see, this is worth pointing out, these are the the months of the year, and they are indicated by astrological symbols. And you can see here inside the temple itself, which is covered with green, we have the image of Ceres, the goddess of the grain, who is festooned with multiple breasts to indicate her abundant fertility. So, according to Reccioloni and Gallo, architectural historians, nature becomes culture here in this image. Nature becomes culture by means of plants alone, indicating a possible path for man to follow in order to better govern it and to live with it. Or, as André Thuin wrote, the soil is the subject, science is the means, the harvest is the goal. Its principal agents are pasturing and plowing. Pasturing nourishes animals, which in turn fertilize the soil, yielding greater harvest, the two becoming the basis of the true riches of the nation. Thus, the great minister of kings, Sully, called pasturing and plowing the two breasts of France. And we do notice a particular obsession that Lequeux had here with breasts, and for which reason I thought it was useful to show this, because what typically happens with Lequeux is that some of his profound peculiarity gets lost in the seductive beauty of his drawings. His sketches, on the other hand, are just plain weird. And here we have a cetacean which he has decided to draw, which has also been offered up as a self-portrait. The female, du phoque, the female of a seal, and the naturaliste, the offspring, hybrid offspring of a naturalist and a seal. This is that, and you can see large breasts. But the idea here is precisely, when I mentioned previously the idea of the soiling of France through the process of naturalization and the fear of miscegenation, this is precisely what is going on here. On some deeply subconscious level, there's a profound fear of the marriage of science with agriculture would produce this kind of abomination. And this, too, is happening here. This verges on the creepy. It's extremely unusual. And this has, its meaning actually is far from clear. It is extremely unusual on multiple levels. Not worth unpacking here, but definitely strange. So I wanted to show this to you, though, because I think it's really important to try to recapture or to stress some of the deep peculiarities of some of these dialogues, which now seem to be a little bit, they're so remote that we somehow don't see that. Okay. In addition to the official decrees and administrative budgets that allocated increasingly large sums to the museum's gardens, a variety of architectural projects addressed the museum's physical expansion correspondingly stressed its nodal position in the culturing of the country as an unalienable natural resource. Here it is useful to examine a relatively unknown museum designed by Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who also you would note the very peculiar spelling of the word, which appeared in the incomplete third volume of L'Architecture without any sort of accompanying commentary. This project was brought forward by architectural historian Michel Gallet, who ventured little explanation of Ledoux's museum project other than hypothesizing a date of sometime after 1792, based on a loose association with the transformation of the Palais du Louvre into a Musée de la République Française on 27 July 1793. However, insofar as there is no demonstrable link between these two particular projects, what Gallet's connection reveals is the ubiquity of the Louvre as a conventional point of museological reference and the corresponding dominance of the art museum in modern historical imagination. Not only does Ledoux's circular partie depart from the sharp-cornered plans characteristic of previous academic museum projects, of which perhaps the best known is the during the revolutionary period, Etienne Louis Boulet's grand and poetic colonnades shown here. But Ledoux's detailed program placed no emphasis whatsoever on objets d'art or any genre of rare or precious objects. Instead, the ground floor of the four-level building included a chicken coop, stables for horses and cows, a milking room or laiterie, a kitchen and oven room, a pantry, laundry rooms, and general storage rooms. A mezzanine featured two multi-room lodgings, residential quarters for household servants, extensive linen closets, and an area for storing fruit. The second floor included 6 individual bedrooms, each provided with its own study room, which rimmed an imposing two-story central granary, where winter provisions such as straw, hay, oats, wheat, and barley were to be stored. In other words, animal food. At the uppermost level, a centralized pavilion featuring a Apollo rotunda at its center offered 3 arms respectively dedicated to painting, natural history, and sculpture. This last, however, was specifically a salon de sculpture modèle agriculture. And here you can see it up here. I have really terrible slides, I know. It's down here is where, this is actually upside down. Oh dear. Not that it really makes a huge difference because it's a terrible slide. But this is this is the top floor where the Salon Apollon, you can see the Apollo Salon is right here, and this is where the sculpture with the agricultural models is right here. And around here you can see this is where the sleeping quarters are in the laterie and so on and so forth. Because unprecedented, misspelled, and offering no further basis for elaboration, the stipulation of this sculptural salon remains extremely vague. The caveat modèle agriculture obscures rather than clarifies, suggesting possibilities ranging from the arrangement of Beaux-Arts objects as if planted in tilled rows or organized according to Linnaean classification, to the straightforward display of agricultural machines as type models that could be expected by working farmers. Nonetheless, it is evident that the functional program of this museum bears little in common with the museum of art such as the Louvre, even as the Louvre existed in 1794. Instead, the program recalls the features of the Maison d'économie rurale as set forth by Grégoire and announced in a concours of 13 Floréal Year 2 as by the Temporary Commission on the Arts. Projects were to be submitted in 3 months or 13 Thermidor Year 2. Ledoux responded with a design for an actual farm, and I actually have an image of this, but it was on a slide and I couldn't get it converted. But here is the program. Following the invitation extended to artists to occupy themselves with useful and agricultural establishments, Citizen Ledoux offers plans, sections, and elevations of an ornamental farm that answers to all needs, a large-scale sheepfold of known application and utility, as it is known that few worlds are as fine as those of Spain or England. A public market brings together subsistences of the first necessity at the frontiers, and there will be granaries for surplus. So, in any case, he concludes, nature who sees everything with the same eye does not vary in her principles. So, in many cases, except for the partie, the actual aspects, the program of the actual farm was remarkably similar to what you see here. Bearing his solution for the ornamental farm in mind, Ledoux's circular museum begins to acquire a different charge. It spirals inside an empty expanse of arid ground. And here you can see this is the actual museum, and this is the plan, the plot on which it's positioned. It spirals inside an empty expanse of arid ground, relieved by virtually nothing except a few concentrated rows of trees, so dwarfed in scale as to appear to be shrubs. And here are the trees here in the front. The semiotic emptiness of the visual field, conventional except for its sheer enormity, suggests a future written in the perfect tense, its disturbing alterity implying not only the hopeful blankness of unscripted possibilities, but also the futility of the endless loop of infinity that starts at the museum's unmarked portal and returns again and again. Quote, "Everything is circular in nature," wrote Ledoux. The stone that falls into the water propagates infinite circles. Centripetal force is incessantly countered by a rotary motion, unquote. Depending on one's point of view, this figure 8, which you see here, appears to be circumscribing 2 shallow basins, or alternately, to be tracing the bases of hillocks. In other words, 2 breasts. It is impossible to determine whether these regions are convex or concave or merely flat, repeating the leitmotif of ambiguity. At first glance, it is perhaps, as Gallet proposes, an ideal museum inside a mysterious garden. Except where are the plants? And crucially, this land is not so pristine or arbitrary as it initially appears. Lightly dotted lines define disjointed paths which follow no regular geometrical pattern. The River Seine, down here, flows turgidly at the foot of the drawing, and the upper quadrant here, you can just see, pops up obstinately outside of the image's otherwise perfectly square frame. Bothered by the irregularities of the real, these secondary indications that this is the kind of localized information that is typical of a cadastral plan. Closer inspection reveals that it is showing that contested area of working-class Paris, known alternately as the section Sans-Culotte or section Jardin des Plantes, and that Ledoux has anchored his circular museum at the bottom left corner of the rectilinear grounds of the existing Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle. The specific sectors being activated suggest Ledoux was informed by a series of proposals initiated in May 1794 by the Committee of Public Health and passed the Committee of Public Works for supervision, which would have augmented the grounds of the museum from 50 arpents to an astonishing 270. And arpent is extremely difficult to define. It's usually guesstimated as being around an acre, but those are subject to debate. So the existing grounds from 50 acres to 270 acres. The committees proposed the block acquisition of adjacent grounds framed by the area known as the Levant, the Pont Bernard, and the Boulevard de l'Hôpital. Thus become the most beautiful garden in the universe, this vast garden of natural history would henceforth present a completely realized microcosm of the physical world, just as regenerated Paris will be that of the moral world. The committees further requested that following an open competition, a general architectural plan for the museum project would be submitted to the Jury des Arts for approval. If the timetable had in fact held to the original proposal, competitors would have submitted their drawings to the Jury des Arts in the month of Fructidor, or September and October, simultaneously the first and last month of the revolutionary calendar, which had designated the first day of the new year as September 22nd because it marked the vernal equinox and also marked the day when the sun moved into Libra, la balance, the astrological sign of peace, justice, and reason. Conveniently, the National Convention also noted, it is also the time when fruits ripen during its happy season, when the earth, fertile through man's hand, yields her gifts and magnificently rewards the farmer for his care, his fatigue, and his industriousness. If Libra was the sign governing the revolution, the month of Fructidor itself was personified by the sign of Virgo, the virgin gatherer of wheat, wisdom, and the analog of Ceres, Isis, she who brought the earth out of chaos, wrote the convention, establishing the origin of things and of time. But it is the eye-hook icon representing Leo, the lion, which governs the month of Thermidor or August, that was traced here by the lower loop and circular footprint of Ledoux's museum plan. Those of you who are Leos will recognize this. A fully natural cycle of political destruction and renewal, or revolution in its most terrestrial sense, was thus implied by the double loop of infinity, tracing its languid arcs across the ground and in perfect geometry, willfully denying the violence buried below the surface. For several months, the proposal had been proceeding smoothly, with no hints of trouble or resistance. By the end of June, the proposal had successfully passed all of the preliminary stages, including the approval of both committees, the writing of several drafts, and the resolution of specific articles to be named in the decree. But the open call to the artists ultimately never went out, and the designated terrains were not annexed until the following century, when Napoleon ascended to power, and then only at a much reduced scale. Apart from the usual demurrals regarding the deplorable insufficiency of funds, the specificity of Ledoux's vision suggests another reason why these expansive plans were summarily aborted. Quote, "This immense space where the imagination will not be stifled," unquote, as Ledoux proclaimed of this project, was not glorious but ghastly in its barren enormity. By the fall of 1794, Robespierre's head had been harvested by the scythe of the people, marking the end of the Second Terror. So here you see the executioner, having run out of people, executes himself. And then down here you see these harvests of heads piled up in mocking the fruits of the harvest themselves and when they're displayed. The necessary component to regeneration is death. Hence, Ledoux's museum is also a mausoleum, and its vast garden is a vacant cemetery. Arcadia has been evacuated. Far from being ideal, Ledoux's results reach too strongly of reality. Instead of living plants, this museum leveled the temporal exigencies of humanity as well as of history. For the profound isolation of this museum results from the relentless effacement of an urban fabric comprising nearly 1/3 of the Latin Quarter, one of the oldest districts in Paris. As unsentimentally envisioned by Ledoux, its haphazard bricolage of residences, shops, markets, schools, public squares, and streets would be sacrificed to the recuperation of workable grounds suitable to be being placed under culture. This area was extremely working class, noted the members of the various revolutionary committees, and filled with industrious citizens. In brief, the political plan to place this area under culture required the ruthless displacement of the working poor whose lives and livelihoods would be sacrificed to an ideological vision. Quote, after having begun to trace the immense circle of work, combinations, and experiences necessary to achieve the goal, wrote Julien Belair in year 2, the immensity of the enterprise frightens to the point of drawing back, of abandoning the project, unquote. He was referring to the aggressive suppression of fallow lands projected to provide 2 million people with daily work along with income and food, transforming them from mendacious beggars into happy and healthy cultivators. Fed and fulfilled, these people would in turn give birth to an incredible consumption of fabrics, linens, drapes, and hats, all of which would stimulate the factory industries to a brilliant level of activity, thus ensuring the nation's future prosperity. But the niggling problem was the vicissitudes and inclemencies of the seasons, he wrote. Only by triumphing over nature and subjugating its irregularities, Belair concluded, could agriculture become a true art. But the people of the Quartier Jardin des Plantes were not artisanal drapers and hat makers, and they did not wear fine clothing. They were tanners, roofers, and wood sellers. In other words, they were the working poor whose trades involved noxious and frequently dangerous raw materials. So here in this image, the view of the Jardin du Roi, from across the side, the Bastille is over here. We are shown the outside of the Jardin du Roi. But what interests me is, in fact, what you see going on here, which is precisely the trades of the working poor, which Buffon tried desperately to get rid of, and which would all been displaced by the recuperation of these grounds as gardens. So in the front, you see stacks and stacks of wood being sold for ordinary kinds of lumber. They're being transported in heavy drays, barges up and down the river, which of course are heavily polluted. And all of this is taking place. These are the working poor and the kind of mendacious beggars that Buffon feared would steal his delightful imported fruit trees. So this is all taking place outside, and this is precisely the reason why these gates were built in the first place, out of fear of the poor having the inappropriate attitude towards the natural science going on inside. So this is, all of this would have been razed and gone away as a result of the museum plans. In Belair's comments, one can hear the beginnings of the branding of France as a place of luxury goods, such as champagne, brie, and lace fabrics, valuable precisely because they are coded to a certain image of the land. The image is carefully crafted to remove all traces of the soil because what is actually being sold is an aesthetic. This revised position emerged with exceptional speed in the political dialogues surrounding the museum, even as the profoundly idealizing agricultural ambitions for the museum disappeared into an economic model predicated by the commercial exploitation of natural resources. And whereas Ledoux's museum has been today utterly forgotten, the most famous image of the revolutionary institution shows us Utopia's garden, renewed. In year 3, a profoundly rehabilitating set of watercolors by an artist named Jean-Baptiste Hilaire casts the Museum Gustave Eiffel as a paradise of social harmony achieved through gardening. Everywhere we see happy gardeners, happy Parisians, happy professors, strolling through tidy gardens filled with potted plants. And there is absolutely no hint of the ongoing class war that is rolling right outside the museum's walls, and even the gardener's clothes and hands are perfectly clean. The beauty of the watercolor helps efface the underlying political strife, as well as the social realities that have vanished into the annals of history. In its place, the annals of the garden, the allegory of the garden, an allegory that is vague, appeasing, and now shockingly familiar. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Thank you. That was really fascinating. Yes. There's a microphone.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Committee for Public Health and the desire for the farm products. And I was also wondering if there was if it's necessary at this date to still talk about the role of Rousseau Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his lectures and role at the Jardin des Plantes at this time?
Yeah, that's really a two-part question.
I know. I'm sorry. Two questions.
Now I forget. I'm just thinking now. You made me think of Rousseau, and now I've forgotten the first part of your question already.
The first one was about the committee.
Oh, okay. Sorry. What's actually extraordinary about this is the degree to which the revolutionary committees were actively involved in the shaping of the museum. There's literally boxes and boxes of documentation regarding their desire to shape all of this into farms, and then I actually have explicit orders to carry out the program, but then it never actually got to the point. They actually did run out of money. But again, the crucial factor they didn't really fully appreciate was the pushback from the people who actually lived there, because it generally would have raised pretty much the whole Latin Quarter would have been disappeared, and created an enormous garden. I mean, there's plans, there's drawings of that. It's absolutely amazing. But the part of the difficulty was they didn't know what exactly they were going to do with it once they had the land. And the people who actually lived there pushed back very, very hard. They didn't think it was fair or right that the government could come in and just take their property and not give them fair compensation for it. And then Napoleon came in and everything changed. But the Committee on Public Health was extraordinarily active, and they were, in fact, promulgating actively a physiocratic vision where they truly saw agriculture as a salvation of the nation. And it got to the point at the height of year 2, it got to the point where anybody who was all foreign trees were being pulled up and castigated as being terrorists and things like that. It was really quite strange. And there was a lot of political intensity that was being directed towards this for agriculture being the solution to everything. So, yes, it was quite extraordinary. Rousseau was an extraordinarily important component to this. I mean, there's a bust of Rousseau dedicated to him. He was constantly being invoked for the notion of education and the correct raising of the youth. This was closely tied to a program of public education and literacy that was particularly aimed at farmers and the rural poor who were largely illiterate at this time. 85% of France was illiterate at this time. So they really wanted to try to tie those two together. So the idea, the pastoral ideal combined with the practical realities of agriculture were both being promoted simultaneously. It isn't a completely tidy picture, as you can imagine. The picture is rather complex. And there were sheep there too, as I'm sure you know, running around quite happily and being, lots of crossbreeding was going on. So they were very interested in the domestic commercial potential of exotics, of which sheep were a primary target. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.